Good afternoon, and welcome back to our top three, middle three, and worst three changes for Warhammer 40k Ninth Edition. Today we're going to go over the middle three changes. So basically, the changes that, while they did something, they didn't really go far enough into changing Ninth Edition. I don't want to focus on it too much because it might come off again as the worst three, part two, but it's still something that we should talk about. So the first one is vehicles. Generally speaking, the change to vehicle shooting in combat is kind of cool for them to be able to shoot back, but really they should just have a rule where they can fall back and still shoot, so that melee armies still have an opportunity to box them in. Right now, as it stands, it feels a bit silly and again against the lore perspective to have a tank swarming with gene stealers, just turning its sponsors and heavy bolters onto itself. I like the idea of melee armies getting within shooting range of a tank so that it's ineffective. The idea that it can actually just stand there and shoot things that are on its hull, it just doesn't really seem to make sense. I know in last edition that's why they were locked down, because it makes more sense to not be able to shoot back at the enemies that are on top of your vehicle in that moment. And then in that edition, in 8th edition, when you fell back, you couldn't shoot with your vehicles. I think here a better change would have been to make it so that all vehicles get the ability to fall back and still shoot, especially if they're not locked in. So currently the way it works is you get 20 gene stealers on a tank. They're all around, 50% of the hull, and the tank doesn't have to fall back. It can just shoot right into those gene stealers, even though they're literally on top of it, crawling all over its hull. I like the idea of better for it to have to back up and then shoot so it can get an angle with its weapons. And that also gives you the ability for these melee armies to still be able to box in certain vehicles, either against terrain or against the board edges, things like that. So it makes it so there's still a little bit of strategy for the vehicles and how you place them and how you aim them and where they're going, so that they're not left in a vulnerable position that they can get trapped in. Currently, there is no vehicle traps anymore. They can just continue functioning as normal when they're in regular combat. Albeit they can only shoot the enemies that are targeting them or fighting them in the melee, and they can't shoot their blast weapons at that close range. It still just seems really weird in the way it plays off, and it's another debuff to melee armies. And the reason I bring this up as the one change that didn't go far enough is because I like the idea of making vehicles slightly more effective, but and the way they did it was the wrong way, I think. I really think it should have been all vehicles can now fall back and still shoot. Maybe with a -1 to hit or something like that, because they're moving so quickly, they're just trying to get out of dodge. But it just doesn't feel right from a lore perspective for, say, Alemian Russ's sponsons, which obviously have a very specific angle of fire, to be able to turn on a Gene Stealer that's literally standing on top of it to shoot it. It just doesn't feel right. On top of that, I mean, that kind of goes with the whole idea that vehicles don't need, field of views or fire anymore. They can just shoot any weapon in any direction at any time. But regardless of that, that's something that's just part of 8th edition and Ninth edition and this new Warhammer idea. I just think, more importantly, some of these changes need to be more focused on the way it feels on the tabletop and the lore. And currently, it just feels silly for vehicles to shoot into combat, and it just makes it even harder still for melee armies to be viable. So currently, this change, it's a pretty simple one that I think could have gone a little bit further and could have just been done a little bit better. I like the change that they're trying to make vehicles more effective in combat. I didn't really like how they were locked down so effectively in the last edition, and then they would fall back, and they couldn't empty their contingent of troops if it was a transport, or they couldn't use any of their weapons once it finally did fall back. The second change that I think didn't go far enough is cover. And this is a hard one, because cover, generally speaking, has been kind of difficult in 8th edition. I don't like the lore of it, but you know, in Ninth edition, they did do a few good things. So I do love the line of sight changes, but really, it's just armor is generally weaker in 8th edition, so there needs to be a better way to get better defenses across the board. Currently, it seems that spamming invulnerable saves, like with the Tau and shield generators, is the only real way to survive in this game. So rather than shoving cover saves as a flat, whatever, there should be something similar to 7th edition, where it made it harder for damage to get through at all. So I would say cover saves, instead of being in the same vein as armor saves, they should be more like an invulnerable save, like maybe even a whole separate list of saves that is different based on the different cover that you have on the table. I don't like the idea that a Space Marine with a 3 plus armor save standing in a bush now has a 2 plus armor save. I don't think that really represents well what cover does, and I don't think Space Marines should want to be in cover to begin with. So in 7th edition, if you had a high armor save already, cover didn't really help you any because it was almost a separate invulnerable save. So if you were a Space Marine and you had a 3 plus armor save, and you were standing in heavy cover that gave you a 4 plus armor save, and you got shot by a weapon that was AP 3, the cover save wouldn't help you, but the armor would. So I think it's just weird the way that they're doing cover now. It's from 8th edition. It was still weird. Now instead of having these armies that they should be tough and able to stand and fire, kind of like in the Astartes video, where a Space Marine takes that las cannon shot and he's fine, right? That's the kind of thing that you want from cover. Because if it had been just a cultist standing in front of that, he would have been demolished, right? So really speaking, this again goes back to the lore of it and why the vehicle shooting combat change didn't go far enough. The cover changes didn't go far enough because it really is something that all armies can use, but certain armies just benefit off of it more than others. So if you're a guardsman with a 5 save, and then you're in any kind of cover, you have a 4 save. But there are so many AP minus 2 weapons now that it's still just a 6 plus save. Whereas with the Space Marine, now they're at just a 4 plus save. It doesn't make any lore sense. And I know I said that already, but that's really what I got to reiterate about these rules is that they haven't made the game feel more like Warhammer or Space Marines fighting, Chaos Space Marines or this far future grimdark kind of fantasy setting. It just feels almost like they took the easy way out for a lot of these rule changes. So if they did want to do this with cover, I think cover should either be an invulnerable save, and it should have different levels of cover. If it's a bush, if it's a building, if it's a rock, those are the kinds of things that need to be re-implemented into the game. Are these general little bits of strategy that you can see across the board that add to the story of what's actually happening. Currently, there really isn't a story. It's a kind of a min-max game, and it doesn't really matter where you stand. You just kind of stand somewhere that looks kind of like cover, and that's it. So I like the story of Space Marines charging down an open lane where there's no cover because their armor is already so tough. And as they're going, there's a bunch of guardsmen standing in the buildings around them, popping shots off at them while the Space Marines try and pop some shots off back, right? So the cover changes didn't go enough. I know they have light cover and they have heavy cover to try and add some more to the lore of it, but the fact that heavy cover is more to give a -1 hit to melee, I think it just doesn't feel like a really good change. It doesn't feel like it made the story of the cover any better. It's just another thing that's in the game that doesn't really matter. You still just want to shoot the crap out of the army across the board, and that's it. And cover doesn't really provide you enough of a bonus to not be able to just get shot off the board immediately. Back in 7th edition, if you were in the right kind of cover, it would take a heavy, heavy weapon to get through there, or you have to get somebody with a flamer to go up there, or something like that. Right now, cover, if you're a weak unit, the cover is not going to save you in any capacity. If you're just a bunch of cultists standing in a crater, you're going to die. Plain and simple. Because there's too many weapons that have minus APs. And even when they don't have minus AP, you're not necessarily getting a much better opportunity to save. Whereas before it was you could use this huge save because it was heavy cover. Basically, you could turn a cultist into a Terminator because they were in such heavy cover, which is as it should be. If somebody's in really, really deep cover, they should be getting hardcore saves. If all you can see is just a little face on the side and they're trying to shoot through a bunker, that makes more sense than, a cultist standing in a bunker and his armor save is still only just a 5 plus. It doesn't feel good, doesn't feel right. Kind of going along with the table size changes, it makes it so that all of this terrain that we've established over the years, it just feels more worthless now. It's just kind of a backdrop to take prettier pictures. So cover, it still needs a huge rework in this game. I'm glad that they moved towards making heavier cover and making more line of sight changes to assist in kind of this cover mentality. But overall, it needs a lot of work. Finally, the last change that didn't go far enough, and I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this one because I think it's been discussed on too many times already. But the stratagems and the extra CP. So I like the idea of CPs being balanced across the board so that each game has each side not needing a CP battery. But I do think this only highlights the problems of stratagems. So I've played a few dozen games as the Thousand Suns, and I think each game I use the same 4 core stratagems and another handful of edge case stratagems. So why do we have so many? Not only does this make it feel like each loss is the result of a lack of understanding on what's happening or what my forces are capable of, it makes it feel like to understand an opposing army, you have to also know their 100 strats. There was a reason why games aren't going as quickly as initially advertised, and really I think this goes back to that terrible glossary I talked about in my other video. It's that you're constantly having to just filter through all your stratagems to figure out what to do in that moment, or if there is a stratagem that you can use, especially now that there's all these psychic awakening books and there's more stratagems upon there, that you're just constantly litigating what stratagem it is and if it's appropriate for the moment. And now that you have even more stratagems, you don't have to worry about having the stratagem CP crunch. You can just use stratagems all the time and just constantly be looking it up. So basically, whenever any action happens that anybody feels like it might fall under a specific edge case, everyone just dives their faces into the books and looks for the stratagem that can fit that edge case. In 8th edition, this was not quite as big of a problem because CPs were much more limited. So everyone knew what their core strategy was. You could tell your opponent, hey, this is probably what I'm going to do with my 4 CPs that I have. And then the opponent could say, okay, well, this is what I'm going to do with my 7 CPs. And there wasn't as much generation. So once they were done, you knew what the opponent was going to do. But now, with everybody getting like 12 CPs at the start of every game and regenerating 1 at the top of every command phase, there's just so much recharging of CPs going on that everyone's just popping off CPs, popping them here, popping them there. All these kinds of different stratagems going off everywhere. And it's hard to keep track of. And it doesn't feel right that when you feel like you finally got an advantageous position, they just pop off a stratagem that's some edge case stratagem that they wouldn't have used in 7th edition because it wasn't worth it because they wanted to use something else. But now they can't use it because they have so many CPs. So generally speaking, I think stratagems are, not only are there too many CPs, I feel like there's too many stratagems, and that's the main thing. I think they should get rid of 90% of the stratagems for each side, bring it back down to 4 or 5 stratagems, maybe a few more than that can fit on one page and that kind of fit the lore of the side. So the Thousand Suns and Chaos, they can keep their Chaos familiar, they can keep their Endless Cacophony, things like that, things that are always being used, but make the side feel more like a Chaos side. Whereas, the Imperial Guard, they can keep some of their artillery stratagems or reroll their weapon hits and or how many shots a heavy weapon gets, things like that. I think those are fine, but there's no need for each side to have so many stratagems that every single time everyone's just constantly looking in to see what they're trying to get. But anyways, those are the 3 changes that I think just didn't go far enough. So the stratagems, remove a bunch of stratagems, kind of unify, make it so that there's a max amount of stratagems that each side has and they're lore friendly. Cover, it didn't go far enough because while they have heavy and light cover, and I like the line of sight changes, cover still doesn't feel like it's a component of this game right now. It just feels like it's something tacked on so that maybe you can feel better about standing in a crater. And then vehicle shooting in combat, it doesn't feel like it makes any sense, especially from a lore perspective. They should just technically be able to fall back and shoot. So I like the idea that they're not being locked in like that into combat when they get into melee, but they really need to be able to move backwards and then shoot rather than just shoot in combat, because it just doesn't make any sense the way it is. And then this way you can still allow flanking melee armies the ability to lock them down if they get them in the right spot boxed in. So really, the changes that didn't go far enough, it feels like they didn't go far enough because it affects the lore too heavily. So we really want to make sure that when making these rules, it makes sense on the battlefield and it's balanced. Again, this is also, it's not really, it doesn't feel balanced across the board. So we want to make sure that they feel balanced, they feel lore friendly, and that they make the games feel much more strategic rather than just a slamming of whatever possible rules you can min-max out of the game. So that's it. That's the end of this series. Those are 9 changes that I think Warhammer 40k needs to do in 9th edition. But if you agree, let me know. If not, thanks for watching, and see you guys in the next video.